us understand them, are trying not to be 16 or 17. They're kids who had a breakdown at the beginning of puberty. And it was usually a silent breakdown. It's not something that you see usually in clinical work. It's something that's reconstructed later. But that's what we're talking about. We're talking about a child who physical puberty, in simple language, freaks them out. In other words, they're not ready for it. They're not ready to have a body that's beginning to look adult. They're not ready to have feelings and urges that are beginning to be sexual. And the emotional side of them says more or less, Gewalt, this isn't for me. Now, if you turn your back on your development, something is going to go awry, and that's what we're talking about. You see, the adolescent who begins to feel more like an adult and doesn't feel that they're ever going to be able to get to be an adult, ever. Because all of adolescence is about another step and another step. But this is the kid who stops the steps at the beginning. He says, this is just, I'm never going to be able to be an adult. And if I'm not going to be able to be an adult, I'm going to have to be something else to pretend to be an adult. But I'm not on my way to adulthood. I'm on my way to a different developmental path, which is a path that avoids, it's a detour around adulthood. And as you can imagine, it doesn't work. It's just an attempt, like most things that we see as symptoms, it's an attempt at self-treatment, which ends up making more problems than it solves. So what you have is a child who actually wants to remain a child, because being adult means being both sexually mature, and the child cannot imagine that. It means being emotionally mature, and emotionally mature here, what I mean is mutuality. The possibility of being engaged in a mutual relationship that has respect for both sides and that people can grow together. That's what adults do. As you know, the original formulations of psychoanalysis, which were done by men, suggested that we go from dependency to independence. 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 You want to see what independence looks like? Go to Washington. That's what independence looks like. So women in the 90s said, why? Women don't want to be independent, but they also don't want to be dependent. What do they want to be? Mutual. They want to be able to grow from one-sided relationships to two-sided relationships. So that's what we're talking about here. Being an adult means being able to participate in a two-sided and mutually constructive relationship. And it means, you see, when you become an adult, the child says to herself or himself, uh-oh, this means that I no longer have somebody else who's responsible for me. Now, I'll give you an example from the first day of medical school, where one of the professors of medicine said, when it's 3 o'clock in the morning, and you're in the emergency room, and somebody is brought in and needs emergency treatment, you're going to have to learn to overcome the urge to call a doctor. You're the doctor. So the adolescent is going to have to overcome the urge to say, what does daddy say? What does mommy say? Give me guidance, I don't know. Because when you become an adult, you do know. Another adult may have more experience than you, but that doesn't take away your responsibility for what you know. So, as you know, Oedipus involves two things. The first thing, which is obvious, is that Oedipus has to do with a conflict with a parent of the same sex. That's obvious and disputable these days. But what's indisputable is that Oedipus was fighting with somebody bigger than him. Right? In other words, Oedipus is based on the fact that I have a parent who's different from me qualitatively. He's an adult and I'm not. That's what's called the Oedipal parent. And the Oedipal parent is a great luxury when you need it. And you need it until about the age of 11 or 12. Because until you have mature thinking, the thing that frightens the child the most is to think that he will be in the hands of other kids, because he knows just exactly what they're like on the playground. So a child needs to have adults. It's not something that's forced on them, it's something that they need. And particularly they need to have parents that they can count on, so that they don't have to depend just on themselves. So that's a big plus. And to give that up, to say, well, not really. You know, these guys are bigger than me, and they have more experience than me, but they don't think better than me. As a matter of fact, they're, you know, when you look at the What the thumbs do, they're hopeless. You know, the cutting line is whether you use your thumb or your finger. Anybody here use their thumb? I'm hopeless. So it's not as if they're better at everything, but the main thing is that you give up on the idea that somebody else can be responsible for me. You give up on that idea and say, it looks like pretty much I'm starting to be responsible for myself. And that is a big loss, not a big gain, it's a big loss. And you have to feel enough supported, and then we'll talk about how that takes place, to be able to give up on the edible parent. So these are some terms. Are they clear? It's not, just jargon. It means giving up on daddy knows best. Now, if you can't make that transition, then you decide to remain a child. And that's why I say that the child who's had a developmental breakdown at puberty, when we see them at 16 and we think we're going to talk with them about what kids think about when they're 16, they're not into that. They actually are seeing themselves more as still a child. And that means that sexually, they see themselves as a child. Now, how do you see yourself as a child sexually? That gets expressed in what we saw in I skipped one line. When you think about, when you think about when you think about sexuality as an adolescent, and here we're talking, you'll translate it into different cultures, right? In other words, obviously in the Brent Center in London, they're not necessarily talking about Haredi kids in Jerusalem. So there's a pretty big cultural gap, and you have to translate terms that have to do with things like masturbation, which are part of a generally accepted part of culture in some areas, to some places, cultures where that's not so easily available. I'll let you do the translation. But what it means is that when you imagine sexuality, you don't imagine mutuality. You imagine yourself as a child in the sense, an edible child, in the sense that there's somebody bigger than you who's taking care of you. That the fantasy of sexuality, which takes place, they call it a central masturbation fantasy, because in cultures where masturbation is quite acceptable, the fantasy grows over time. If you look at adolescents, when they masturbate, their fantasy goes from pretty much being a child being taken care of, let's say with boys, mainly of a mother's breast, more or less. It takes a while to get the fantasy to move into something that's genital sexuality. And that's what they're talking about, that in the kids where there's a developmental arrest, it doesn't grow. It stays, if it's heterosexual, with a woman taking care of me. If it's a boy, if it's homosexual, and the example that I had translated into Hebrew is one of a homosexual one, but the issue in the example wasn't so much that it was homosexual, but that the fantasy was that there's a big daddy who's going to take care of me, that I can remain a child. That sexuality is not something that's involved with mutual fulfillment and mutual pleasure. It's something that somebody takes care of me. Yeah?
Are these fantasies conscious?
Yes. The question was, thank you, the question is...
The Haredi
right.
people know that it's usher
Right.
to masturbate, it's usher to have fantasies. So
Right.
you're talking about conscious fantasies nevertheless?
Right. As I say, the question is, are they, it's going to take a while, by the end, right, I'll learn this. There's a sign that says repeat the question. You see how well it's thought out? That takes care of me and it takes care of you. And if I didn't tell you, you wouldn't know that that's what the sign said. You just think that this lady wants to wave at me. So, as I said, the translation of it we'll leave to, because this comes from a different culture. But in the English culture, yes, it's when people engage in masturbation, then these are the fantasies and these are how they grow. And you talk to a kid and you ask about, fantasies, not in the first session, but somewhere along the line, and you get this developmental line in this masturbation fantasies. That's a new thought. That wasn't there. Now, masturbation fantasies don't need physical masturbation, right? So the idea is that the concept, the fantasy, the way that you think about relationships, and it's quite conscious. So if you're in the Haredi world and let's say you can't talk about Right? Because there are therapists who would say, wait a second, it's also to talk about it, because if you talk about it, then you give you legitimation. So that's the people, there's certainly range in how people approach it in mental health, because, you know, we're dealing with adolescents who, when they have an adolescent developmental breakdown, they're in certain risk of suicide if they can't grow. So they're not talking about something sort of irrelevant. We're talking about pikuach nefesh. Safek pikuach nefesh, you know, something. But anyway, that will leave to your postscript. You can certainly talk about how they imagine being married, because a Haredi boy is supposed to imagine that at some point he's going to get married, and at some point he's seen that his couple, his family are married, and you can try to discuss whether he imagines. I'll give you an example, but this is a translation that I haven't tried, so it's not as if I can actually tell you that it works. I think that you probably have more experience than I do in these areas, but let's say you say, well, you know, let's say you imagine the Shabbos, you know, Shabbos Tish. How do you imagine it, right? And if they imagine it, that I come and I say Kiddush, I sit down, and I'm taken care of, and everything is taken care of for me, and I don't really need to pay attention to how people are feeling. Somebody else takes care of the kids. You know, I just sort of sit and maybe I open a book. So that would be a kind of a fantasy of being a bit of a child, rather than being a partner in raising children and creating a spiritual experience. That's a first time attempt to translate it. Does it give you an, but it's your question was, is it conscious? It's conscious. It's conscious, yeah. Okay, it was an important question. So what you end up with emotionally is, if you think you're a child, then you're not free from Oedipus, because you, as you know, as Freud even said, how do you get free from Oedipus? You grow up, you grow out of it, right? Sometimes you get stuck, but overall, in the normal phase of things, where not everybody is neurotic. There was once a time where people believed that it was possible for not everybody to be neurotic. So according to that idea, so how did you get past Oedipus? You grew up, right? In other words, you saw the future. That was Freud's formulation. And you said, well, I'm not going to have mom, but I'm going to have somebody like her. And I'm not going to struggle with that, but I'm going to be like him, right? So that happens when you grow up. That was put around the age of 6. Fast forward to 12, it makes a little bit more sense. And so that's optimal. But if you don't do that, then you end up always struggling with anybody who is an adult. So what you see in these kids with, you'll see that in the therapy, is they'll be struggling with you. Why? Because you're an adult. But you see, I'll give you a simple example. There are kids who go to school and say, I could run this school better than you, right? They say, look, you know, this hour isn't the right hour for this, that isn't the way to put this, that isn't the way, I can run this school better than you. And if you're the principal and the kid comes in and says, look, I expect you to listen to me, I have things to say, right? And if the principal, we also say Avanissim, says, what a gift, a kid who thinks about not just himself in school, but the school. This is a kid with, you know, we call it Neve Rosh Gadol. He's high-minded. Let me listen to you. And the kid gives his suggestions, and the principal says, you know, we're going to take care of them. It'll take 100 years, but we're going to work on it, because these are very thoughtful things. And the kid says, I'm happy to have been involved. That's a kid who's on the way to be an adult. There's another kid who says, I think this school is all backwards and wrong. And the principal says, well, come tell me about it. Why should I tell you about it? You don't understand. You're this big klutz. And if it's wrong, it's because you made it wrong. And since you made it wrong, there's no way to talk to you about it. So you see, he's perpetuating a struggle which he doesn't plan to succeed in. He plans to perpetuate it, because that's the way he remains a child. And you'll see adolescents like that who are so busy fighting with adults. Not because their ideas are bad, but because they're using them mainly not to grow. The issue is whether you use whatever you have to grow or not to grow. And here is a kid who is, this is what's called the ongoing struggle with the Oedipal parent, that you recreate adults as Oedipal parents. I'm small, you're big. But instead of saying, help me to become like you, you say, I'm going to struggle against you forever. And I know I'm going to lose. It's broken. So these kids, no adolescent can say I'm a child, correct? You won't find an adolescent anywhere, there's a question of conscience, right? Who will say, look, I'm coming to you because I feel like I'm a child. Go find that adolescent. They all say, I'm big. The question is, what kind of big, right? And the child who wants to be in this perpetual struggle defines himself as broken. Mikukal is broken. In other words, something is the matter with me. And that's why I can never change. And so you'll have a child who comes to therapy saying, look, you want to change me, but you can't change me because this is just the way it is. And they start to struggle with you about whether you can change them. That's a struggle with the edible child. And it's a way of saying you can't change me, but I can't say that I'm, like everybody else, or that I'm on the way. As a matter of fact, I'm not on the way. If you ask them, excuse me, could we think about 2 years forward, where do you want to be? So what's the matter where I am now? How dare you say that I have to change? That's the problem with all you big people, huh? So those are the adolescents who are proclaiming something happened to me a couple years back. Now, in other words, the beginning of puberty, it freaked me out, and I took a detour. I couldn't continue to develop. And a lot of times we forget to go into that. We see them as 16, and we say, well, we're going to solve a 16-year-old problem. And we don't go back to 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. 6th, 7th, and 8th grade are sort of like untreatable characters that everybody knows, you see in your calendar, 7th grader, oh, no, 7th grader, give me a 5th grader, give me a 12th grader, 7th grader, because it's amorphous. But this kid, if you don't go back and say, look, let's go back to 6th grade, and imagine how you saw that you're going to become like your father, or how you thought you were going to be able to be an adult. What did you think? And the kid said, I never thought about it. I never thought of it. Just, how could I possibly? And so then you can start to reconstruct the difficulty. It's not common in our thinking to go back to that particular period. We love to jump back to 2, right? 2 or 3, and then we say that it's attachment and blah, 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 and the usual stuff. And then we skip where the problem exactly began. And in terms of empathy, we're thinking things through, but we're not connecting with what the child's actual experience was. A couple of questions, yeah.
I'm interested to know if there's research to show that children who physically develop more quickly, more rapidly, when they're not necessarily prepared, whether that has an impact on this problem.
But the question, the question was, it's a global question with a particular application. The question is, what contributes to this? What makes it more difficult? What makes it less difficult for a kid to get through this passage of early puberty? And but that's what we're going to be talking about. The particular question was, what if the kids begins to become pubertal at 4th grade, when there's less emotional maturity? And we'll go in later to a way of looking at that, but the answer is sure, that stresses it. In other words, if you see a kid who has premature puberty, precocious puberty, so you say to yourself, we always say to ourselves all the time, how is this one of the things that's going to affect his development, right? But we don't ask, is this going to make that? Because that's too simple. But could it be an influence, and should we be doing something about it? For example, should we be talking with him or her about the precocious puberty in a way that makes them older and more able to deal with it? In other words, making them a virtual 7th grader, even though they're in 4th grade, so that they can not become freaked out by this developmental stress, right? So it's certainly a good example of one possible developmental stress. Yeah.
I was wondering, when you see a teenager, is your, formulation that any issue that a teenager has is based on this, or just certain issues?
Certain. The question was, it's a very important question, because every time you come up with a theory, the first question that comes up is, oh, God, here it is, the answer to everything. Everybody has a developmental breakdown in puberty. I need to take every single adolescent I'm seeing, squeeze them, even some of the adults, and squeeze them into this framework, because that's what it's all about. It's not. But I'm glad you asked. What we're talking about is some particular very difficult adolescence. You may find it also in some of the 20-year-olds or the early 20s who have trouble launching, and you ask them what their adolescence was about, and it wasn't about anything. And then you go back to puberty and you find this. But in the adolescence, where you can say, where are you going? And the adolescent says, look, it's a rocky road, but I'm going somewhere. That's not what we're talking about. Because for those adolescents, you don't need me, you need something else. So what we're trying to do is to talk about when you're stuck, right? When you're doing what you would usually do with adolescents, say, this is just, how do you know? Because you feel lousy as a therapist, right? You feel like you're pulling things off the shelf. I have a lot of books in my office that make some people happy, and some people say, which book did you just take out now and throw into my head, right? So you try to do, search around and you come up with nothing. That's where it's useful to think maybe we're in London with the Laufers, right? But it's certainly not, there's nothing that's for everybody. Now, yeah.
Are there differences between boys and girls in this theory, or more or less they both go along the same muscle?
Right, gender differences, that's the question. We're going to come at the end to some aspects of gender that are relevant. The original formulation was not gender specific. In other words, it's true that in London and in all Western cultures that adolescent girls do not engage in physical masturbation to the extent that males do. That's certain. But the idea is that the crossing over of puberty can freak out boys and girls. And so we'll see if we get to it at the end. This is aspects of gender that we can look at, but right now we're talking about something that's for both genders. So like almost everything else in mental health, when we want to say what are the components, so your question is premature puberty a component? What are the components? How can we think of the components of the adolescent breakdown? What makes it possible to pass through early puberty? See, one of the ways that we think about development here is to say that it's not such a big surprise that it's not easy. The development is schwer zu sein, right? It's not so easy. And it's not so surprising that there are aspects that make it rough going. And that this isn't something that should surprise us so much. So we want to think about what are the components that make it possible. And there's a lot of brachot that make it possible. But when the brachot are missing and there's a couple of klalot, so it becomes impossible. So how could we formulate the components that are personal, that are family, and that are social? And at the very end, gender is another aspect of it. Now, so far so good. When we talk about the personal aspects, the first thing we want to talk about, surprisingly enough, even though we're talking about emotional development, we're talking about sexual development, that we're actually talking about a person, and a person also thinks, and a person also learns, and that one of the first things that's important in looking at a kid who's 12 is how has he learned, how has she learned up until the age of 12. And this is what Anna Freud referred to as sublimations. And I'll explain the context of sublimations in a couple of minutes, but in brief, sublimation is an unfriendly English word. And undoubtedly, the Freuds were not thinking in English. Anna Freud had perfect English, but she thought in German. And the term that we're dealing with, anybody here know German? Yiddish, is the German word Aufhebung. Aufhebung is to lift up. Auf is up, oif, right? Aufheben, right? It's the lift up. And sublimation comes from the Latin root, and it starts with something different, under. So it's peculiar, it's not a friendly word. So if you want to think about it as Aufheben, it's more exact. What it means is that from the age of birth until about 5 or 6, children, if you look at the balance between their ability to think and their ability to feel things immediately, the balance is in favor of what they're feeling right now. Their ability to think comes second. That switches relatively around 6 or 7. It's known in brain science as well. Something at the age of 7 changes, And kids become, it's not as if they, it's called latency, but it doesn't mean that there were no urges. Anybody who's taking care of an 8-year-old kid knows that there are plenty of urges. But the relationship between the ability to think and the ability and the being driven by the urges changes. It's in favor of the ability to think. And that creates a 6-year hiatus until adolescence, when the urges come back strongly, where it's relatively easier to make thinking relevant to how you feel, rather than being driven by how you feel. And when you have that, that's, grade school, right? The purpose of grade school is to have children love learning. Love learning. They could be learning about Pokemons. Doesn't matter what the love is, but the love of learning means that you love yourself. And love means an instinctual pleasure, that learning gives you pleasure. So it's a rerouting of instinctual pleasure. Reroutes, it's a detour. It reroutes it, rechannels it, and it's like the new train to Tel Aviv, they say is going to happen. We have to say anything about that too. It's a different train, it's a different track. And the instincts, the urges that we have, start to become fulfilled in thinking. Thinking gives you pleasure. Thinking gives you pleasure. Anybody who's taught children knows when you say something to a child and you see light in their eyes, that's a sublimation. In other words, you're building something where thinking gives you pleasure. And the ability to do that, if you don't do it before the age of 12, it's going to be rough going when the instincts now are stronger than the thinking, right? The balance changes. So the first chapter of the first book about adolescence, except for August Eichhorn, was Peter Bloss in 1962. For some reason it wasn't translated into Hebrew, but that doesn't bother you, right? Peter Bloss wrote a book called On Adolescence, and the first chapter is not on adolescence, it's on latency and it's on sublimations. And what he says, very simply, is if you don't have sublimations, you're not an adolescent, right? So you can see that that is one of the components that now is going to come into this understanding of puberty and the developmental breakdown, that if you haven't learned to love your brain, to love learning, and to have it give you pleasure, then when you become an adolescent, you're not going to be able to think about it. And so the drives are going to be too strong, and then you're going to say, Yuval, this is too much for me, because me doesn't include enough thinking and pleasure in thinking to be able to, yeah.
Could we say that today the educational system fosters thinking?
I didn't quite hear you, sorry.
Could we say that the educational system today fosters thinking, nurtures it, encourages it?
There's a question about the educational system today. I don't know what the educational system today is, but a good teacher knows this. A bad teacher has forgotten it. But a good teacher knows that each child has to be taking pleasure in something. Now, learning is not limited to school. So there are some kids who learn a lot about soccer and not a whole lot about the geography and history, but they're thinking. I'll give you an example, of sublimation. So you have a kid, parents drag him in, he's 9 years old. Kid doesn't pay attention, doesn't do homework. In Finland, there is no homework. Doesn't do his homework. He's not learning, his teacher is unhappy with him. What are we going to do? All he ever does is play with the computer. Okay. So you say to the kid, what game are you playing? Important question. Unfortunately, it means you have to learn these games somehow or other. So he says, Minecraft. And we say, oh, well, how many stages are there in this game? He says, about 83. And you say, and what's your favorite one? And he says, 57. I said, well, what did you like about 57? I said, well, there, I would have done a little bit better. When I make my own game, it's going to be easy, but there, this thing happens to that. It could have been like, yeah, it's a good. So you say to yourself, are you enjoying being smart playing Minecraft? Yes, that's what makes me feel smart. So the kid is using the computer to make sublimations. Another boy, 9 years old, not paying attention, blah, 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 comes in and says, what are you playing? He says, Minecraft. Well, how many stages are there? He said, how should I know? I just press the buttons and the gorilla kills the zebra or whatever it is that happens there. And you say, well, do you feel smart playing it? He said, smart? It's a dumb game, but I'm dumb. So I just, do that. You see the difference? So it's not exactly, and the same thing in soccer. You say to the kid, what do you like about, or in fashion, if you're dealing with a girl, not necessarily soccer or Minecraft, but she says, look, there were different fabrics, they're made in different places. Trump says that he's going to make it in America, but we all know that a sixth grader, right? We all know that it's impossible because of the wages and this and that. I say, oh, do you like being smart about fashion? I said, well, I'm going to have a company. So, okay, so she's not learning geography, but the main thing is that she's creating this structure. And that's the structure that's going to allow her to become an adolescent and not have a breakdown. So when you see kids that are before 12, and when they're in grade school, and you do an assessment, the most important part of the assessment is does the child have a matrix within which to create sublimations? If they do, they're going to be okay. The rest will work out. If they don't, it's sort of an emergency. And the closer you get to sixth grade, the more of an emergency is. You can still do it, but once you get into puberty, or to the question before, what if you have precocious puberty? So you see that the sublimations and you have a short time to develop the sublimations, and then it's going to be hard to keep them, right? Yeah.
How do you help a child who may be 7 or 8, who seems to show competence academically, keeping up with schoolwork, doing well, but emotionally they're more immature? How does a child like that, maybe with ADHD, for example, who may have attention issues, and how does a child like that go through adolescence, and how can someone prepare them for it?
Okay, so that's about 7,000 questions.
Okay, sorry.
But I'll, well, no, that's good. We're going to be here for a while. Right, let's say the child is smart academically, but not emotionally, right? That we'll see in just a minute, because we're going to get to Anna Freud. There's a question about how do you prepare them, and also another question about is ADHD an aspect of this. So we're going to get to all three of those, and if I don't, remind me, okay? So let's go to the, you see, we're talking about the adolescent breakdown and sublimations, but we need to put sublimations into some context, and that will help us to see a way of relating to other things. And the context, those plots, but I forgot to translate these slides. The context is Anna Freud's concept of developmental lines. Anna Freud's concept of developmental lines is a subchapter in the book on normality and pathology in childhood. The book on normality and pathology in childhood is one of the most important books ever written about children. If you haven't reread it about 10 times, you haven't quite got it. Anna Freud had a terrible problem, but she was such a good writer. I had the privilege of meeting her editor, and I was talking with her because she was telling me what was the matter with my paper and so forth. And I said, well, and she was saying, well, I said, well, who edits you when you write? She was an analyst and she was writing. She said, everybody needs an analyst except Anna Freud. Everybody needs an editor except Anna Freud. Anna Freud, whatever comes out is perfect. So the Freuds had this capacity to write. It makes it look deceptively simple. It's not a simple book, but it's a book that endlessly contributes to how you think about development. And everything written after that is, if it's not derivative from it, it's probably just telling you a partial story instead of the whole story. Anna Freud said that there's a concept called developmental lines, which is a way of thinking about how children develop, which has 3 levels. If you ever want to lose your readership, make sure that you have a concept with 3 levels. Readership cannot handle more than 1.5. You do a concept in 3 levels. I mean, the Gemara cups here, that's, 3 levels is just the beginning of a Tosfos, but the average readership, 3 levels of conceptualization is too much for most people to bother with. But there are 3. The first is what we could call the floor, if we take this room as development, right? The floor are things that you're born with, aspects of your personality that that develop along a certain line. For example, how you eat. Those of you who are still dealing with little children know that your daughter or son who's eating now at the age of 8, there's a direct line that you can follow back, and that's what mothers do. They say, oh, just like at his first birthday, or just, that's how he nursed, And so there's a way of eating that develops over time, and that you could see as sort of the floor of development. Or there's a line of people who love to be around people, people who hate to be around people. It starts from the beginning, and then it moves along. But you can see a continuity in development. People who don't see continuity in development don't see people. There's continuity. People are people. They're continuous beings. And of course, the first developmental line, which Papa Freud was responsible for, was the psychosexual line. It's a line that has to do, if you don't freak out about the word sexual, you know that you're talking about the way that the pleasure in the body is organized, right? Because when you say that there's an oral stage, what you mean is that the pleasure that the child takes in his body, which in adults is called sexuality, because that's what organizes it, is organized around the pleasure of the mouth, right? And then it gets organized around the striated muscles and the anal sphincter, and then it gets organized around the genitals in a childish way, and it's continuous with the development of the individual later as an adult. There's a continuity there. That's all so it's another developmental line, how you organize the pleasure of the body. Now, there you go. So the structure of a developmental line is, first of all, you have the line itself. That's the floor. The second level of developmental line is what you do with the different lines. And we take a simple example. The child at the age of 2 points to Shoko at the table, says Shoko, and is happy before he gets the Shoko. At the age of 1, he needed to get the Shoko, right? Why is he happy before he got the Shoko? Because he's made a stitch. He's made a coordination between language and eating, right? There's a line of eating, there's a line of language, and whoop, he made, and only he can do that. That's not a given. That's something that you do. That's how you create yourself. You sew a coordination between these two lines. And if by some historical retrospect the child also says, please, Shoko, please, then he's even happier, before his parents are happier with themselves, alone with the kid, because he's made a triple stitch. He's stitched together object relations. Saying please is object relations, how you deal with people, right? People, eating, language, starting to feel like a mensch. That's all there is to the coordination of developmental lines. And what happens is that this, the child feels to be, see, these are the walls of the child, because he's starting to feel, this is me. How I put them together, this is me. How I put them together. What I got isn't yet me, because I got them. How I use them, what I do with them, how I connect them together and create myself, that's me. That's, the ego in the sense of I. Freud, as you know, never used the word ego. He only used the German word I, which is the same as the Yiddish word I. Ich. So that's the coordination, and let me just go a little bit further here. See, in these coordinations, the most important of the coordinations is sublimations. Some of you probably already guessed that. Because what do you do when you sublimate? You take the physical urges for pleasure and the mental capacities to learn, and you make a big stitch. You pull them together. So the child feels that the pleasure, learning, you see, isn't necessarily mine, but the pleasure at learning is mine, because that I created. The teacher gave me the material, it's material. But if I did with it something that gives me pleasure and creates a structure in myself, that's the ultimate of the coordinations of the lines, and that's what we call it before sublimation. See how it fits in? Yeah.
Are you also going to talk about what happens if development stops at this stage? Let's say the environment doesn't respond to the child who says, Choco, please.
Yeah, the question is, am I going to talk about I'm going to train, this is a conditioning lab. And you say, I get to repeat the question before you've gotten to the thing, but your hand is already moving to it. So I create a new behavior that every time somebody asks a question, your hand is going to do this even without the sign. I'll prove it, I'll take the sign away, see your hand. So those of you who behave, students of Skinner, there it is, it's about all it's worth. So am I going to talk about what happens if the answer is yes, if this becomes a difficulty? I'm about to talk about that. Now, you see that sublimation is a big stitch, and ultimately, the ceiling of development is all the things I've stitched together. It's my ability to continue stitching, my ability to continue to coordinate the lines of development as the world comes at me. I can handle it. What does it mean I can handle it? I have an ability to take things that come at me and put them together with the way that I put myself together. And so I interact with the world and the world becomes mine, right? That's a pretty simple idea, but that's the ceiling of development. That's what's called the ego. Somebody who can continue to stitch. And if you want to make it more plastic, in the early 20s of the last century, Anna Freud, you know what her training was? She was a teacher. She knew kids. And so it occurred to her that maybe all this stuff going on downstairs in Freud's study could be interesting for children. So she sat with some, troubled girls in Vienna in the 1920s. Well, what on earth does a bourgeois teacher do with bourgeois children, girls, in Vienna in 1920? You know what they do? They sew. So she would sit, because that's what people did then. So to be a woman and to be with a girl. So she would sit and sew, and the girls were sitting and sewing. And 30 years later, she realized that that's what they were doing. They were stitching developmental lines together. It's sitting and sewing together. Now, you can easily see that there are things that can disrupt the possibility of developing sublimations. And all of those are what are called stresses on development, on the coordination of developmental lines. There was a question about puberty. What happens in maturity, in intellect, and not in emotion? See, it's a question about developmental lines, isn't it? In other words, let's say that the developmental line of emotions is kind of lost. Not because something happened, but because the kid is a little clumsy with what's called object relations, which means getting along with people, right? So one of the worst translations ever is object relations. It means getting along with people. So how you get along with people is less developed than how you think it in class. So it creates a stress. There's a certain stress if you think about the stitch. How do you stitch together something that's over there and something that's here, right? If you think about learning disabilities, that's a developmental stitch. It's hard to make, and it sometimes comes apart. And every seamstress knows what it feels like when the stitch comes apart. And if it's a stitch inside, it's awful. It's a real trauma. So it's hard to make those stitches, but what if you happen to be brilliant? What if you happen to be a genius, right? So your intellectual development is going to be way ahead of everything else, right? That also is not just a bracha. That creates a developmental stress. It's hard to make a stitch between being brilliant and being nine emotionally. So all of those need attention. In other words, when you look at a child, what we look at is what's going on in the schmata factory. In other words, how are the stitches going? What are you able to do? Where is it more stressed? I'll give you an example of the geniuses. In America, they refer to these kids now as Mindstein. So you have a Mindstein, and in schools these days, what do? They say, oh, this kid doesn't need a school. Yet, as you know, all schools really are very happy. They promote themselves based on all the children who don't need a school. Those are their successes. Kids who come in, learn by themselves, go out, and they didn't need the school. So the school says that's our success. That's the latest in Israel Chinuch. That's not what Chinuch is about. It's the kids who needed the school and succeed or don't succeed. Those are the kids that the school is for. So, but let's say you have a kid who's brilliant, and so he's getting good grades, but he's not working. He's not working, he's just getting good grades because it's easy for him. The thing I forgot to tell you about is in order to take the urges and turn them into a new structure, you gotta sweat. You have to put effort into it. It has to become part of you. It has to become not what the teacher gives me for grades because it came easily. Those kids don't develop, believe it or not, they don't develop sublimations. And one of the real dangers of brilliant children, and you know, in Israel they have this crazy idea of mechunanim, the gifted children. But you know, what's gifted in our society is decided by the budget, like everything else. And in the average country, gifted means 3.5%. In Israel, the budget is for 1.5%. So you have to be way, 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 way over the top. And then you neglect all the kids who are not so-called gifted, who are. They're just in another country, but not here because of the budget. So those brilliant kids, if you say, well, are you working? No. Do your grades give you pleasure? Give my parents pleasure, and then they leave me alone. Or they give me a prize. That's not the pleasure I meant. Does it give you pleasure to get a good grade? I said, why should it give me pleasure? I didn't do anything. They just, got a good grade, so everybody's happy. Well, what challenges you? And so if you're in good shape, the kid will say, don't tell anybody, but I have this secret passion for, I don't know what, for geography. So when I go on Google Earth and I figure out the different altitudes and the difference in the atmospheric pressure and how that creates weather, that gives me a lot of pleasure, right? So that's, the kid he's gone around school. Or in a better situation, he says, well, my teacher says, look, you're studying, everybody's studying the Gemara with Rashi. I think that you might want to look at the Rambam too. And as a matter of fact, maybe you should have a look at Tosfos. Try it, and I'll try to help you out. In other words, push yourself a little further. No grades, just pleasure. Just creating the structure. And if we're not in such good shape, then the kid, as we see sometimes, it's sort of tragic. You see these little geniuses, they get to 7th, 8th, and 9th grade, and they collapse. They stop learning. And everybody is, everybody's surprised, and you say to themselves, hello, what's the surprise? Did they have sublimations? No, they had good grades. So what's going to keep them going in 7th and 8th grade? Now you have the urges going, and you don't have a structure that gives you pleasure. So what if you're good at it? It's not me, right? So that's the importance of that stage. And so obviously, if you see a kid who is having trouble passing puberty, the first question you ask is, do you have sublimations? How did you make sublimations? What was involved in it? And if you see that there aren't, then believe it or not, these kids, one of the most important aspects of the treatment is to get the brain back in gear. Sometimes the assumption is that, well, it's an adolescent and, he's not going to study, and what does he care about studying? That's a tragedy. If he's not caring about the pleasure of learning, the pleasure that he can get out of thinking, he's not going to ever get out of adolescence. It's actually never going to get in. So the idea of saying, well, don't go to school, well, just hang out, well, that's not so robust. It's sometimes sort of a necessary step, but you'll find in most of these programs for lost adolescents that at some point the kid says, and now what am I going to learn? What's brain food here? What's going to make me feel like an adult? I'm not going to feel like an adult if I can't think, and I can't think unless I have pleasure in thinking. So that's the first aspect of creating the ego, and so that'll be one of the risk factors of the passage. Somebody you asked before about ADHD. Well, now. Here we're going to get to ADHD as well. Do you know that it takes a little time to think? It's been quantitated. In other words, consciousness, if something goes past you at shorter than 1/100 of a second, it's not there. It's not recorded. That's very quick, 100th of a second. In order for something to be recorded, you need to have about 1/4 of a second, right? But in order to process it, to reach consciousness, to be able to say, there's an I here. Consciousness is me, right? And say, you had a thought, something appeared to you, something occurred to you, you need between 4 and 6 seconds. 4 and 6 seconds is 4 and 6 seconds. It takes 4 and 6 seconds to say 4 and 6 seconds. It's a line of poetry. It's the lines of most songs. It's a unit that's a unit of consciousness. And you need to be able to hold that unit together for between 4 and 6 seconds. And what happens if at 2 1/4 seconds you jump? What happens if if your attention doesn't hold 4 to 6 seconds? It's jumping around. Now, as I don't need to tell you, we're not going to go into the details of it here. There's a huge debate about whether ADD exists, what exactly it is, how it should be treated, whether it's... There's a huge debate. You know, some people think that just we're poisoning our kids with God knows what, we might be poisoning them. And some people think that the schools have created it. And some people think that it's a real biological entity of ADD, which is, if it's there, it's the least clear biological entity that exists. The literature is terrible. So we'll leave that up in the air because God only knows. There are kids who don't pay attention. And if you don't pay attention, guess what you can't do? You can't think, right? You can't create those moments. Let's say it takes 4 to 10 seconds to stitch. That's stitch consciousness. So in order to create a situation of consciousness, you need to be able to have thinking that's long enough. So ADHD kids are in risk of not creating sublimations, and if they don't create sublimations, then they won't be able to do well in adolescence. They won't be able to get past the transition to puberty. So that's one of the risk factors. You're starting to see how you can take anything and put it into this thought about developmental lines. That's what's useful about it. Everything fits, right? Anna Freud didn't think about language at the time, partly because the French were in the middle of this whole unexplainable thing about language with Saussure and Lacan. She said, I'm staying out of this, but language development is a line, right? It's not in the book, because people want to stay away, but how language develops is a line. There are kids who are gifted in language, there are kids who are challenged in language, and so anything can fit into this rubric. For example, after Anna Freud died, people started to think about the coherence of the self and cohort. Fine, another developmental line, how the self develops. See, but the issue is where it fits and how it's put together, and so forth. Yeah.
I see one of your slides here. It says that another risk factor is PTSD.
That's on the question is, why do I have PTSD on the slide? First of all, to see that somebody's reading the slide, and second of all, because it was from a lecture on PTSD. But since you asked, as you probably know, post-trauma, one of the principal manifestations of post-trauma is a lack of attention, right? And so people, if you have a population, for example, a population that I live in the South, and you throw missiles on them, which, even the threat of a small missile, we in Israel, we have some peculiar ways of thinking about things. We say, well, like a SAM is a small missile, a Batsmar is a tiny missile. These things kill people. They scare the daylights out of people. So even the threat that somebody might actually succeed in exploding something from the air near your house scares the daylights out of normal children. Israeli children are normal children. So after Tzuk Eitan, for example, where Ashkelon particularly took a beating, Ashdod and Sderot, we started to see an awful lot of kids being diagnosed as ADHD who weren't before. And they weren't. They were post-trauma. And Ritalin, guess what, makes it worse. So it's important to recognize in our surroundings, people in Jerusalem have already forgotten what it was like in the early 2000s with the buses blowing up. So Jerusalem had its period of trauma. Right now it's been the South. It looks like it's going to be again. And those are things that make it hard to grow up. So, another way of looking at it is in another British way of doing it. Do you know the work of Peter Fonetti? Peter Fonetti is the successor of Anna Freud, essentially, or the successor of her successor. After Anna Freud, the director of the Anna Freud Center was Joseph Sandler, who was here in Israel as a Freud professor. And after that, Peter Fonetti is working for a psychologist. He's been working for a few decades on development. And if you don't know his work, you're a little out of date. It's worth turning on the sublimations and challenging yourself. His ideas are not so simple. And the main term, which you'll see is a terrible term. English is not a great term. Not a great language for things. In Hebrew, it's untranslatable, is mentalization. Mentalization means using your cop. That's what it means. Mens is mind, and mentalization means using your head. As there's no way to say that in Hebrew, because Hebrew doesn't have a word for mind. The word for mind in the Bible was lave, which became transmuted into heart, meaning emotions. It's not what it meant most of the time in the Bible. And when lave stopped meaning mind, there wasn't another word for it. So we don't have a mind. And it's one of the reasons that Maimonides chose to write in Arabic, because Arabic had a term that was a translation of the Greek term for mind, and then he could write, because it's a little hard to be Maimonides and not write about the mind. In Arabic, it's aql. Aql means mind. We don't have a word for it. We have a mind, but we don't. We have a word in Yiddish, kop, but that's another story. So you can see that the notion of mentalization has to do with something that people do together, where they create thinking that's new. Mentalization is a process, it's not a content. It's not something that you have. And if you want to, you could say to Fonetti, why don't you call it a stitch? It's part of the coordination of developmental lines. It has to do with symbolization and with reflective thinking. Those are complex matters. They can't take place if you don't have complexity, right? In other words, if the world comes at you piece by piece and you don't stitch it together, you can't create complexity. If you can't create complexity, you can't think about complexity. If you can't think about complexity, you can't be an adult, right? So kids who, if you talk to them and you see that they're not really able to be engaged in mentalization, what would that look like in the room? You say, well, because my teacher threw me out of class and I'm not going back. You've heard that one, right? So you say, well, you know how it is. You make this sort of, well, let's think about it. And the kid says, what? What are you talking about? Think about it? What are you talking about? What's the answer? You agree with me or you don't agree with me? He says, well, we need to think about it. I said, what? You just, you're taking I said, that's the way the teacher talks. I see, that's how adults talk, big people talk. I don't talk that way. So I'm not thinking about things. So I came here for you to tell me that the teacher's wrong, or else I'm out of here, right? So those of you who know Melanie Klein will say, oh, well, it's schizoid paranoid. It's all and none, it's black or white. But it's not only that. Schizoid paranoid also is not complex. Black and white means no complexity. So we're unable to think our way through something that could be more complex. Now, can you do therapy without complexity? Back to Skinner, move your hand. That we can do without complexity, right? But nothing else, right? So you have a kid who, if he hasn't created the ability to sublimate and to take pleasure in his mind, there's no real reason why he would go through the effort or believe that mentalization is the usual process. That leaves him very alone in the world, because mentalization is how we talk with other people, how we think together. The questions that you ask are a process of mentalization, right? You take something complex, you say, wait a minute, how about this? And then I try to mentalize with you, and we create something that wasn't there before. That supposedly is fun. Otherwise, why would you be here, right? It's also fun. It's not important for you, whatever, but it's also fun. It gives pleasure. And so these kids unable to maintain that kind of pleasure, and as a result, they're stuck in a very concrete world, very concrete, simple world. I think you get the idea. That's all we need for this particular discussion. That, you know, if you haven't passed, if you don't have sublimations and you can't think complexly and you don't have the ability to create conscious stitches, then you're going to have trouble engaging in therapy. And we've all been there and wondered what on earth to do. I'll try to get to that in a minute. Now, so far we've talked about the individual component of the failure to become an adult. There's another component, and that's one more familiar to you, I suppose, which is the family component. Because when you're 12 and you're thinking about being an adult, you're probably thinking about being an adult like your parents, right? And so one of the great questions in the family will be whether the family needs a child. In other words, particularly if you're the last child, but you know, maybe the designated child. You know, kids have different roles in the family. That you say to yourself, you know, as long as I act like a kid, what does it mean like a kid? That mommy takes care of this, and daddy takes care of that, and mommy knows this, daddy knows that, and I don't know anything. The family seems to be okay. But when I open my mouth and say, I don't think so, things seem to fall apart. Things get tense. There's tension between something. It's as if the family is better off if I'm a child, right? So the role of a child will be a contributing factor, not the only one, but a contributing factor to a difficulty in becoming an adult, and crossing over the threshold, because it looks like it's good for the family if I just hang out here. Now this is connected to what I refer to as the adolescence of families, because I don't think there's such a thing as just a personal adolescence. There is personal adolescence, but it's not just personal adolescence. I think that the adolescence of a child, each child in the series, is also a developmental crossroads for the family. And what I refer to it as a crossroads of differentiation in the family. And to explain that, I have to explain to you another term that has three parts to it. Not Anna Freud, not even Jewish. So far, all the terms are Jewish, except for Fornetti. But we're talking about, this is something that's probably familiar to some of you through family therapy, but I think it's underappreciated in Israel. There's one of the founders of family therapy was a goy named Murray Bowen, Midwestern goy. The good goy. And Bowen, he had a little bit of trouble with the rest of, you know, New York and Los Angeles. They're all Jews, and you know, people assumed that he didn't have sublimation, so mentalization. But actually, he was the best theorist of the founding of family therapy. He was also the least charismatic. One of the things that happened in family therapy is that there was a confusion between charisma, because people start making tapes, right? So as soon as you start making tapes, so you're in theater, right? And there were people who were just brilliant at the theatrics. Number one was Sal Manoogian, who was here a lot of the time too, who made tapes. By the way, he only published 5% of the tapes, because the other 95% didn't work. But the ones that he made, so you thought, you know, you think this guy is succeeding all the time, but it's not exactly that way. That's one of the advantages of the tapes. For example, this tape right here, we'll see. 2 more laughs, I'll agree that it can be on the website. So Bowen was powerful, but he was a thinker. And the one thing that Bowen did that none of the other therapists did is he said, to become a family therapist, you have to become a therapist. To become a therapist, you have to change. And if you want to become a family therapist, your family has to change. You have to be in family therapy. So you want to learn family therapy with me? Fine, come, I'll treat you. I'll make you change. I'll show you what it's like. Nobody else did that. Everybody else said, if I just sit behind the window and observe the system, like an Ibn Chocham, right? Then I can know all I need to know, and the main thing I need to do is not feel anything, because I'm just maneuvering. That was the period of cybernetics and games, and so the idea was you can be such a smart person behind the mirror. The only person who didn't think so, well, Whitaker was one, but the most important one was Bowen. But in front of the mirror, he was really powerful, and people went to sleep watching his tapes. So he became underappreciated. But he trained a ton of therapists, most of them also powerful, but a ton of therapists who knew about themselves, worked on their families, and became all of the family therapists that's left in America, practically. So if you look at what's written in America these days, you don't find anything that doesn't deal with differentiation and it doesn't refer to Bowen, which is a huge change. When I came in '83, I had just, I was in New York. We were into theatrics, right? New York is the theater capital of the world. You walk down the street and everybody's acting, right? So it's the theater capital of the world, and so no one cared about Bowen. But I was impressed, so I started to study it. And when I brought it here, everybody said, that's not family therapy. And it was, I said, well, let's give it a try. And I said, I failed, so I'm still trying. I'm going to try to tell you what this is about. But in America, you'll see that it's an important concept now. It has three parts. The first part is as follows. Bowen said, look, when people communicate face-to-face, they can either start from who they really are or from who they think the other person has to be. If you start from who you really are, it's called the I position. The word position is taken from ballet, first position, second position, I position. It's a way of standing when you begin a relationship. It's not the whole story. It's how you begin. You begin with yourself. You say, look, this is how I feel. And the other person says, look, this is how I feel. That's beginning with the I position. Not beginning with the I position is, look, this is how you feel. You did this, and that's because of that. So you're not talking from yourself. So relationships begin with a statement from the I position. The second principle is that relationships remain face-to-face in dyads. People talk together. So the triangle, when you pull somebody else in, when the mother says to the daughter, you can't come back at 3 in the morning because your father will have a heart attack, that's a triangle. If the mother says, you can't come back at 3 in the morning because it makes me feel uncomfortable and I have things that I have to work out, that's not a triangle, right? So you begin with an I position and you don't drag in other people in relationships. And the third thing, which is obvious but unstated, because some of the best theoreticians, you got to schlep them a little bit by the nose to get to where they were going. It's true of not a small number of people. It's true of Bowen. If you say to yourself, listen, Bowen, okay, we start with I positions, and we don't bring in a triangle. No. Then what happens? So he never said what happened, but he said what happened to himself. He gave a paper in America. He had to slip it in. This is family therapy conference. All the big knockers were there, all of them with their tapes and all of them with their great knowledge of systems. So he gave some false title to it. And then he came and he said, don't klutz, but I'm going to tell you about the family therapy I did to myself and my family. And they all klutzed. So what he described, which is published, and he wasn't the world's best writer, but it's a pleasure to read. He created what he called the Tempest and the Teapot in his own family. He was 50. His parents were still alive. He had 4 siblings. He went home and created a Tempest in the Teapot, and things began to change. And then he went on a trip with his father to his father's, area of origin. And he wrote about himself there. He said, and when I said things to my father that I had never said before, and when my father said things to me that I'd never heard before, I began to understand what a relationship is about. So that's not a small statement, but it's not theorized because he was a male and it was in the 70s, it was America. But the theory grows over time. It's what I think the best way to call it is either mutual creation or co-creation. What you do is 2 people create something that wasn't there before, right? The relationship actually grows. It's something that 2 people create that now is, I'm different, you're different, and we're different. And if you think about it, one way to think about how things change is face-to-face with people. For example, if you think about Leila Seder, which is a great spiritual occurrence and an extraordinary family occurrence, and you say to yourself, what's new this year? Does anybody say anything new to each other? Not about, but anybody say anything new to each other about the relationships? So you see that a lot of times you'll see that families avoid this kind of creation. Somebody says, look, why is he always sitting there and how come this is that? And the answer is, let's go in the kitchen. And so things don't happen. Or something heats up, people say things to each other, and something actually happens. Something actually happens. The reason I say that is that, if you take people, let's say, who you're treating somebody in psychoanalysis, and so you're in the 4th year, let's say, and the person says, well, I'm going to the Leila Seder again, and nothing's going to happen. The analyst says to himself, doesn't publish it, but says to himself, maybe this isn't working. What do you mean nothing's going to happen? For 4 years you've been working and changing yourself. That's not going to come out in Leila Seder. Why? Right? But one of the interesting questions is whether analysis or personal therapy is a practice to actually do something in the real world. Because the other is true also, that the week after Pesach, when you come back to your analysis and say, look, I know I'm supposed to talk about my dreams, but just for a moment, I just want to tell you something small that happened in Leila Seder. I blew up at my father for the first time ever, and he listened, and he realized that he hadn't been listening to me and accepting me. And I said, but you can't listen to me because you never listen. He said, try me now. And something changed. But let's go back to the dreams. So the analyst says, okay, we'll go back to the dreams. But in his heart of heart, unpublished, he says, voila. The analysis has done something. Why? Because in the world, between people, that's where things actually change, right? And that's one way of thinking about it. You have a question?
So this is primarily about communication, this system?
Yeah.
You said it's about relationship, you didn't say it's about communication.
The question is, I'm not yet, but all right, we'll work on another round. The question is, are we talking about relationships or communication? The answer is yes. In other words, communication is a deep part of relationship, and relationships don't take place without communication. But maybe you had a different chiluk that I didn't quite follow. 4 to 6 seconds, take your time.
Good, if I have another question.
I'm sorry?
If I can elaborate on the
Okay.
question.
Okay, right. In other words, we're leaving that for the next 6 seconds. So if we take a look at a way of understanding this, it's not very hard to understand Bowen's theory. You see, let's say you have a situation, there's a triangle, right? But it's not really a triangle in Bowen's terms, it's a triad, because there's a relationship here between father and mother. It's a relationship that exists, that can create itself, right? And then let's say father and mother have a discussion about child rearing, understand each other better, and come up with some sort of a way of going about things that's a little different. How does that play out? Mother's relationship with the children is going to be different. That's going to happen between her and the children. And father's relationship with the children is going to happen something different. Do they have to be the same? They can't be the same. There's this myth that, parents have to be the same because that doesn't confuse the children. That confuses the daylights out of children. How is it that mommy and daddy are the same? They're not the same. They don't even look the same. Why would they be acting the same? So the issue is not whether they're the same. The issue is whether they can create something between them that they agree on that creates a change in each of them, which allows a coherent way of each of them relating to the children, but each of them relate to the children, because each system needs its own creativity, right? Whereas if you look at a triangle, you have mother and father, and they need to stay the same. They're in a standoff, right? They've compromised. Compromise is a way of not creating anything, right? They've compromised. And so they say, well, look, we're going to be, bedtime is going to be your way, and breakfast is going to be my way, and there's going to be no discussion about it because we've agreed. And so, because they need to keep their own agreement, the children are hostages of this compromise. So the kid goes to bed like father and says to mother, huh? Hello? Where are you? Just no discussion. This is what you do. And then in the morning, he says, he does breakfast like mother and looks at father and says, huh? Hello? Where? What? Well, who are you? He said, look, we've become good parents. We've gotten good counseling. We agree about everything, so we're not listening to you. Right? And so that's not a great idea. It sometimes, parental counseling sometimes makes that mistake. I hope not too often, but it's a certain danger of seeing the kid only through the eyes of the parents as opposed to allowing the kid to show up and become present. Because if things happen between people, so the presence is necessary. So you understand the triangle, right? Now, there are two forms. This is the most important part of Bowen's theory. There are two forms of low differentiation. Low differentiation is a kala. It's a restriction. Low differentiation happens when people can't afford to be themselves at the beginning of the communication. They bring in somebody else rather than stay just with each other, and they don't co-create. They try to freeze. If you think about it, what they're trying to do is to preserve something that doesn't have sustainability. Because nothing in relationships has sustainability. Relationships and sustainability are not the same thing. Relationships have to grow. That's what's sustainable about them, because the world is changing all the time. So if you freeze and say, look, we're not going to do anything different from how we did it last year. You sometimes hear, say, look, I've been your father for 15 years, and do you think I'm going to become any different now? And the answer is, I was 1 month old 15 years ago, I'm 15 years old now. How could you possibly imagine that you're going to be the same father, right? But the answer is, I can't. I can't afford to change. And so you have to stay. I'm going to treat you the same way. So it's a way of preserving things, but a way of giving up on the possibility of co-creation. So there's two forms of low differentiation. If you think about two people meeting each other, so they can either swallow each other, that's what Nushin called enmeshed. And Bowen had an even worse term. He called it undifferentiated ego mass. Okay, that's what he called it. It means, that people swallow each other up, so you always agree about things. And as a result, there's no co-creation. Or you can turn your backs on each other and say, we're just not talking about it. This is not for discussion. And either way, the result is the same. The result is that there's no meeting, there's no co-creation. And so the issue is, for family therapy, is not to choose between enmeshed and disengaged, but to try to create a higher differentiation. Every meeting with every individual in any therapeutic session always impacts also on the differentiation of the family. That's not an easy concept to accept, and a lot of times we don't notice it. But when I talk with an adolescent starts to feel somebody's listening, I can say that. That's something that another human being can actually hear. He's going to go back and give it a try, right? And that will be a bracha for his parents if they say, oh, great, therapy is challenging us too. Go find parents who say that. But if they do, or if you help them to realize that, it's not going to get easier, it's going to get harder, and then it'll get easier, so then you've impacted. As soon as there's a communication with any one person, that one person is always also a member of a family. That person is also dealing with a certain level of differentiation. And whenever there's a communication that raises the differentiation level by eye position, not being in a triangle, and co-creation, every moment of co-creation impacts on the possibility of co-creation in every family system. Okay? That's not easy, but there's no such thing as individual therapy, right? Why should there be? There aren't individuals. There's such a thing as useful communication with an individual and ignoring the fact that something's happening in the family, like what happened in the Pesach Seder. But you don't have to. You can also be interested in it. And with adolescents, sometimes it's the most important thing to be interested in. I'm not talking about you, I'm talking about adolescents. Somebody's rushing ahead. I think this should be pretty clear that the high differentiation, it's a scale. It's a scale of, here's where your question was. Differentiation is not an individual property. It's a property of relationships. And you can see where this kind of notion fits with the revolution that the women provided in the 90s, where they said, you're always in a relationship. Why are you ignoring relationships? You're always in relationships. So if you're in relationships, so why should it just be individual development? There's also development of relationships, right? So this is a scale of development of relationships, not of the individual. You know, the adolescent who has a change in differentiation in the therapy, we're talking about the differentiation of the communication and relationship that's taking place in the therapy. It's not just a personal property. So in high differentiation, you can have room for I feel, I want, but I'm saying this to you, right? And what's really important is that I'm saying it to you. You, I'm saying this to you. And that allows for the we to be co-created all the time. These are everybody can remember the moments in their life where this happened, I think, and realize how important they are. Whereas in low differentiation, you see either I'm not here or you're not here. It's going to be either my way or your way, but one of us is erased. And you're a vehicle, you're a means to my ends, and the we never changes. It keeps repeating itself all the time. We're going to stay the same way. So, if you think about an adolescent in these terms, you see the adolescent now wants to become an adult, an adolescent who can pass the threshold. In order to pass the threshold, he has to meet somebody who's willing to see him as passing the threshold. In other words, an adult, parents who are going to say, wow, you're on the way to being an adult. And if you're on the way to being an adult, then I can no longer be the edible parent. You to grow up, you need to let go of the edible parent, big, small. So do I. I have to stop being the edible parent too. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to grow with me, right? Does that make sense to you, what I just said? So that's the connection between Laufer and family therapy and Bowen. The Laufer is never mentioned because they're not family therapists, but if you read their cases, you'll see it. And that's not an easy thing for a parent to say, okay, look, the child can say, I'm sick of this edible parent, I want to be big. All right, are you really sick of being an edible parent? It's fun. Being an edible parent is great. Somebody thinks you know everything. Somebody thinks you're always right. Somebody thinks you're bigger than the world, It's very hard to give up. And particularly if the couple is being managed by being edible parents, it's going to be very hard for the couple to say, I guess you're going to bring us up while we bring you up, right? Because if you think about differentiation, it's co-creation. So then the child is working on changing the parent, and the parent who says, listen, Fisher, you're going to change me? That's not your job here. I'm the Abba. Those are not good words. They have a certain resonance to them as part of reality. But they're too limiting. Because you see, the father who says that is saying, I don't believe that I can change. Because after all, why shouldn't I change? What's permanent about anything, right? But if you say to your kid, you're not going to change me, you're going to do it my way, that's a way of cutting co-creation. And it's an interesting question because, some people look at this and say, wait a minute, what about kibud av v'em? But in every society with the most respectful relationships with parents, it's disrespectful to parents not to challenge them. It's disrespectful to parents to freeze them as parents of a little child and not allow them to grow. And that's your job, to make them grow. How do you do it? So, In the best of all situations, you know, a boy is studying with his father and he says, I think you got the taste for verkeerd. That's not considered bad, right? It's not considered, not people would have to ask a kasha, right? So that'll be within, you know, that a father who knows how to learn says to his son, why don't you have any questions, right? I would say that to you if you didn't have any questions, but, you know, he says, what are you, a bulk? Who am I learning with here? You just sit and listen? You don't have a question? You don't think that I could be wrong? How can you learn Torah if you don't think that somebody could do better, right? So with any situation, it's possible to find the cultural niche. But if a child doesn't challenge the parents, he can't become an adolescent. And if the parents can't allow him to challenge, then he can't become an adolescent. And that's the family. But why do I call it a crossroads of differentiation? Because up until 12, the differentiation doesn't really change that much. You know, you have kids, doesn't matter how many, you give each one, this one's the fast one, this one's the slow one, this one's the funny one, this one's the astronaut. Everybody has their place. There's a certain thing that settles in when you think you're having your last child. It gets disrupted if you then have another child. But the family has a certain way of organizing itself. And the differentiation pretty much stays the same because your role is to be Superman. Your role is to be Superman. Your role is to be the great edible parents. When that changes, the differentiation of the family has to change. You see, you've introduced a new developmental need. The child has to have a new role. If it happens that the family can include that role, it's not just that the family has maintained its differentiation, it's raised its differentiation, it's included something that wasn't there before, right? But if the family cannot, family will say, well, we're not going to change. It's not really true. You've actually lowered your level of differentiation because you've taken a child with a developmental need and not responded to it, right? So the child feels that he's not so much a member of this family anymore because he can't grow together with his family. The family is exactly the same when he's 13 as he was when he was 11, but he doesn't feel that. The differentiation has been lowered. So the crossroads of differentiation is another way of looking at what challenges the ability to go over the threshold and become an adolescent. You have to have a place to do it. We'll take a break for a moment from words, because there have been a lot of words. The first time I taught this, there was an art therapist who said, here's Bowen. This you probably recognize, this is Escher, right? And you can see that, like all Escher constructs, they're a little paradoxical, right? In other words, you think you're going up and inside, but you end up being a joker on the outside. And the only place that's really secure in this situation is down here. And so my student said here, this is Bowen before he did his family therapy on himself. There's nothing paradoxical here. It's completely safe. This is a family with low differentiation. It's safe and it's a prison. And he doesn't look like a happy camper. And this is Bowen doing his family therapy. He's put his thinking cap on. He's given himself some time to reflect. And he's considering possibilities that are paradoxical and not paradoxical about how it might be. So for those of you who are more inclined visually than linguistically, that's Bowen in a picture. Now, the last aspects here, we've been talking about the personal, that was educational, stitches, and the family, the differentiation, the crossroads of differentiation. And there's another component of what allows adolescents to want to be adults, and that is, in my society, what's an adult? What's expected of an adult? Can I meet the expectations of what is an adult? And here, in every society, there will be different components, and the Israeli society is awfully I would say, very burdened. There isn't a whole lot of room. And we're talking about all parts of Israeli society, but when you look at the ability to become an adult, a society that has a certain element of pluralism in terms of what can be a successful adult. In other words, could a successful adult be somebody who's a laborer? Could a successful adult be somebody who's a merchant? Could a successful adult be somebody who's a soldier? Could a successful adult be somebody who's a teacher? What is really expected of an adult? And here, I can't dance to that, so you can give it off. Nice try. You told me not to move, so I can't add music. In every society, the more you limit, the more you restrict what is considered a successful adult, the more you burden the threshold of puberty. That's not obvious, but 12-year-olds look ahead and they say, wait a minute. For example, if you say to yourself, there are situations, for example, I'll give you an example from something that I learned from a wonderful group of guidance counselors that I had the privilege of meeting with in Bnei Brak. And so they gave me an example of an adolescent who's 15, who comes from a good family, and the family is very concerned with, thanks for the compliment, with shidduchim. And so he needs to be in a good yeshiva. But he can't learn in the good yeshiva because they're running much faster than it's right for him. Not necessarily because he's dumb, but there's different ways of learning. Once when I bought my shas in 1970 here in Geula, Israeli publishing in 1970 was this was the Chasam Sofer shas, and so I had to spend a lot of time with the guy who was selling it to me because I had to turn every page to make sure it wasn't printed upside down or upside down. So we had a lot of time together. And so at one point he was talking to me about the yeshiva I was in. I was asking him about, he was telling about his kids. And so I said, well, is that a good yeshiva? And he laughed. He said, what are you talking about? There's no such thing as a good yeshiva. There's a good yeshiva for somebody, sometime. That's what there is. So that allows a lot of room. But if the shidduchim and the pressure doesn't allow, and you have to have a brother who is in a certain yeshiva, so this poor kid became the janitor in the yeshiva, so that he could be in the yeshiva and nobody was telling that he was the janitor. He was just cleaning. And so you can imagine that it's going to be hard for him to cross the threshold of being an adult if his adolescence is sacrificed for the shidduchim and so forth. That's an unfortunate social cost of some things, but it's a tragedy for some people, and it's an example of something where the kid needs to believe that who I am, which you recall is who I've stitched together, the person that I've been stitching together, I can continue to become who I am, and in the family there's room for me to become who I am, and it may not be exactly the plan. It may not be plan A. It may be not this yeshiva, it may not be exactly this field, it may not be this particular bagrut. In Israeli society right now, secular Israeli society, the chief victims of this are artists, people who are really talented in art and not so much in bagrut. They're not so talented in doing Chamesh Yechidot Mathematica Physica, they're not so talented in having the teacher tell them what literature means because they think that they have some ideas too, but you have to run to the bagrut and say what's expected. And some of those kids get the impression that to become an artist is just not being an adult, it's being a kid still. And some of them do the detour and become broken adults in order to become artists because there's no way to be an adult and be an artist. So that's an issue that every society, and here it's not just one part of society, every society has to ask itself, are we overburdening our adolescents? Are we giving them a highway or a narrow path to becoming adults? If it's a narrow path, some people are going to fall who didn't need to. Now, here I want to talk a bit about how to talk with kids. That sort of came up, and I just want to mention it a bit. I'm going to go through a certain way of understanding it. You can see a nice Yiddish upon him. This is Robert Keegan from Boston. whose work is totally unappreciated in Israel. It's not translated, but it's very important, and it's in the bibliography. Keegan had a certain way of conceptualizing things that's very useful for development. You'll see that it's influenced by Piaget, but also by Anna Freud. I didn't mean to scare you with Piaget. He doesn't bite because he's Swiss, so he leaves you alone. If you look at a baby and you say, who's the me? Who's the me? So a baby has the original experience that the little me is inside my body. In other words, when a baby of 6 months or 8 months, he can't say it, but he hurts his knee. It's not like he says, this is my knee, and it hurts. The knee hurting is bigger than me, right? That's why he needs mommy, right? That changes around the year, 2 years of age, where we get to a situation where instead of the body, me being secondary and in the body, we get to, this is my body. So the me has become, the I has become bigger, and it includes my body. But when a 4-year-old has a strong feeling, like, being upset or being disappointed, and you ask him, what is he feeling? He says, what do you mean, what am I feeling? It's not a me, it's not an I big enough to hold my feelings. I'm inside my feelings. I'm overwhelmed by my feelings. The feelings are feeling me. He did this and he did that. And you see that the I cannot exactly hold the I. And then when you get to around 11 or 12, after naming endlessly, this is this feeling, this is anger, this is frustration, this is disappointment, and it's your feeling. So the kid not only learns how to declaim it, they can declaim it at 7, but they don't get this point until about 11 or 12, they can say, oh, well, this is how I feel, right? So then, you say, well, are we finished? The I is now pretty big. It includes body and includes feelings. But if you have a conversation with 12-year-olds, and you say, well, they say, well, this is how the school should be run. A 12-year-old, I gave you the example before, this is how the school should be run, this, and this, and this. Those are thoughts. So you say, well, let's see whose thoughts those are. Are there any other possibilities? What are you talking about? It sounds like, Popolitica, for those of you who remember it. I think. So if you think about it, you say, well, wait a second. The I is inside the thoughts. In other words, there are big thoughts, adult thoughts, abstract thoughts, but they don't belong to me. I belong to them. I can't think otherwise. And then, as life advances, and girls get to 20, and boys to 120, you get to the point where the I includes the thoughts. So you say, I had a thought, somebody else could have a different thought. This is the way I was thinking, but it's mine. It's my thought, and it might change because I might change. So you have the growth of the I that includes the body and the feelings and the thoughts. Now, all that is optimal. That's a way of looking at development. But there are some situations where, and the developmental breakdown is one of them, where the I is not big enough for what it's being challenged with. In other words, if you decide that the I can't hold the feelings, or you decide that you don't want to be able to think like an adult, you want to do something different, then you're going to have a situation where you're not going to continue to grow. And there, if you say to yourself, well, when this thing changes, right? See, this is my body, and it's bigger, and then now I'm bigger than my body. How does that happen? Piaget, as you know, was Swiss. So everything happens like clockwork. And Piaget, as you don't know, had a schizophrenic mother, so he didn't really rely on other people. So all the development was inside. And so it just happens. You see, this thing just happens. There's no process between people. But if you look at it more closely, you can say, hold on a second. Here. This arrow should be, okay, that's an arrow that, sorry, I moved. That arrow should be the other way. I moved it from Hebrew to English, and Didn't move the hour. Right. How does it go from one to the other? Is there nothing that also takes place that makes that possible? The change from the small me to the big me. And the answer is, because you're talking with an adolescent with a developmental arrest, right? So if it's developmental shutdown, how do you talk with a developmental shutdown? It's shut. It's developmental. So you got to bring them up. And the answer is, yeah, you're going to bring them up minute by minute. And the way to do that isn't in Piaget. It's in a Jew named Vygotsky, who was really the best developmental theorist of the 20th century. He lived in the Soviet Union. He was a Marxist. He had a little dabble with Kabbalah here and there. And he said something very useful for our clinical understanding of how to deal with the breakdown. And that comes from a very simple notion of building a block tower with a child. A baby is building a tower. He builds a tower of 5 blocks. Everybody's happy, right? And he can't build the tower of 6, right? So when he puts 6, they knock down, right? So then Vygotsky said, okay, well in the West, they take what you can't do by yourself and they call that your developmental level, your IQ, what you can't do by yourself. But being a Marxist and also a Jew, he said, who lives by themselves? Nobody lives by themselves. So what about if you take 2 different kids who are right here, and they build 5, I build 5 by myself, and I don't build 6 by myself. So what if we do it together? What if I build 6 together with the kid? There were 2 different kids. One is a kid who, with me, can build 6, and the other is a kid who, with me, can't build 6. So there's a we, and that we is part of the way that things grow. What should we call it? We can do it together. And then Vygotsky said something very true about the West at the time, which is in the West there's no we. So it has to be either you or me. So if the 6th block, whose is it? He says, that's a Klotzkasher, it's ours. So what does it mean that it's ours? You can see that things have developed. Nobody finds that a strange notion now. It's ours, that it's on the way to becoming yours. That's how it becomes yours, that we do it together, you participate in it, and when you participate in it, every teacher knows this intuitively. When you participate in it, then it becomes yours. That's what homework used to be for. What was the idea of homework? That in class, with the teacher explaining it, you got it. We are doing it. By yourself, it's not yet yours. You go home and here's the thing, you say, Mommy, can you give me some help? And if Mommy says, wow, did you understand it in class? Yeah. And you don't understand it now? No. Wow, that's wonderful. What a great teacher. I'm going to be Vygotsky. And I'm going to continue the lesson because it's on the way to be yours because you understood it in class. That doesn't happen very often. You know what usually happens. This teacher's an idiot. What does she give you stuff you didn't understand in class? Either you got it in class or you didn't get it in class. So what am I, your teacher? So it's not usual to get it, but if you get it, then you see that we're on the way. We are on the way. On the way is we. So this is the sort of thing that Vygotsky referred to as the zone of proximal growth. It's a kid who is enjoying tomorrow. I'm going to know this tomorrow. Right now I know it with you. I participate in it. I'm on the way. You can see that as a stitch. You can see that as on the way to a sublimation. You can see that the fun, it comes from the we. It's not just from the I. Anyway, if you see that, then the question is we can do things together. So remember I talked to you about sublimation, about mentalization, which is something that people do together. So you talk to this kid, and you say, let's think about it. He says, no, I never think about anything. And you say to him, no, I don't mean that you should think about it. What I mean is that I'm going to talk to you about how I'm thinking, and come along, let's make a we, right? Because he's used to saying you. So we said, well, I'll tell you how some of us, how I might think about it. Hang on for a couple of seconds, or take your rhythm and hang on for a couple of seconds, but hang on for a couple of seconds. And this is how I might think about it. And you see that the kid is listening. That's all you need to see. To say, oh, We're in Vygotsky land. We're creating something that's the zone of proximal development, something that he's participating in. The moment you stop it, he says, what was that? He said, well, don't worry, we'll do it some more times, because I see that there was something, I looked in your eyes, I had the impression that it wasn't just nonsense. It's not just your way of thinking, and it may not become your way of thinking, but you're taking part in how I'm thinking. You can see how when you're dealing with a kid who has a developmental arrest, that you're dealing with development all the time. But if you sit quietly and say, well, think about it, or, what are your associations, or tell me your dreams, and he says, I don't have any dreams, I don't know what associations are, and I think I'm out of here, right, which we've all seen. So you haven't helped them very much. But if you say, look, we can do things together, but you don't have to lead, you don't even have to agree, you don't have to sign a contract. For example, I know that you, went to the emergency room and you took pills, and you're planning to do it again, and you're here because the school says you can't come back until somebody says that you're not going to do it the next minute. Okay. But, what would happen if you said to yourself, I'm going to give this suicide 2 more weeks? Would the suicide still be the same for you if you do it in 2 weeks as opposed to now? Most kids will say, what? The time? Adolescents forget about time. They don't have time. So they say, together, give ourselves 2 weeks. So the average adolescent said, what do I care? I'm going to be dead in 2 weeks. What do I care if I spend 2 weeks with this idiot or not, right? So, somebody that makes you happy. So actually, it's important to me. So we have 2 weeks, so we have time. And what do we do in the time? We mentalize. We do things that you can't do by yourself. We don't do it instead of you. We don't do it against you. We do it together so that it's something that you can do together, so that you can grow on the assumption, which is a good assumption, that when the child is taking part in it, we're stitching something. She's stitching something for herself. Something is happening. I'm not going to be able to prove it, but it's a better assumption than either she's already treated or I can't treat her. In the middle, you can always think out loud. So that's where that fits clinically. And I'm just going to, I think I'll end with this slide. We won't get to gender today. Come back soon. I think we're a little over in the concepts anyway. The best way to know if a kid is in movement is to ask if you're in movement. Because we're talking about co-creation. Therapy is co-creation. If a kid is participating with you, you see, we always ask, has the adolescent moved? Has something changed between the beginning and the end of the session? What is the change in him? Do you know? No. What do you know? You can say, has something changed in me? Because when we start to deal with developmental arrests, we deal with our own development. We go back to the age of 12 ourselves. And we say to ourselves, among other things, how on earth did I get through this? There were so many things, what was my way? And if that was missing, could I, so you start with every adolescent, I can just attest to myself that, doing it for 35, 40 years, nothing ever repeats itself. So there's always something to learn. There's always some aspect where you say something, okay, something changed in me. If something changed in me, that probably is a sign that something changed, because what we're talking about is this mutual change. You see the hours growing together? Should I do it one more time? For those of you who missed the show, this is the show. This is the summary of talking with kids with developmental arrest. That something happens to us, that we do something, and the test of it is that I feel that something's happening to me, and that can be summarized in this statue. This is the statue. You see, it's a nice statue of a male and a female figure who are facing each other in eye positions, and here's the same statue. See, this statue, unlike me, is able to dance because they're on. And so what we remember is that there are moments of connection. There are moments when we feel that something's being co-created. They're not all the moments. A lot of the moments that are left out are moments when you're trying to get back to it, when you're sort of thinking about things. But if there are moments of that co-creation, that's where we meet ourselves. That's where we do another stitch in our own development. And that's where we do the stitches together with adolescents who are having trouble sewing. Thank you very much.